All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where we find you in the TOC world today. For those of you who I have not met, I'm Marcia Hutchinson, the General Manager for the TOC ICO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. We also have Jessica Banks with us, who's our tech wizard, and she will be helping out as we go through this webinar. Today we have Robert Newbold with us, and he's going to present his webinar entitled The Project Manifesto. And just a little bit about that webinar. It's the TOC critical chain approach to project management isn't just about scheduling, but how can you describe it clearly? In this webinar, Rob shows how to encapsulate CCPM in 4 simple values. Along the way, he challenges a few sacred beliefs. Robert is the CEO and founder of ProChain Solutions and one of the world's leading experts on TOC critical chain project scheduling and management. He has over 25 years of experience developing process improvements in various fields. Rob is a frequent writer and speaker and holds degrees from Stanford University, State University of New York, Stony Brook, and Yale University. He is also a contributing author to the Theory of Constraints Handbook and is the author of the books The $1 Billion Solution and Project Management in the Fast Lane. Also, Rob has a 3rd book on critical chain, which is scheduled to be available in early 2014, and hopefully he will give us a little bit of information on that. So, Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thank you, Marcia. Let's see if I can get this straight there. Yeah, thanks also to TOC ICO for hosting this webinar, and thanks for those of you who have taken some time from your Saturday to attend. As the introduction indicated, I think we've kind of struggled over the years to say what critical chain is. I know I have. We're pretty sure it's not just buffers and resource leveling, even though I think the latest PMI, Project Management Institute, definition of the critical chain method pretty much says it's about buffers. Nailing down what it is can be difficult, and I'm going to show you what I believe is a good way to think about it. And in fact, I think this approach goes far beyond critical chain. I think you can think about ways to apply it in finance and operations and supply chain and so on. And actually, this is the topic of the new book. The new book is going to be called The Project Manifesto. Should be out in the first quarter of 2014. It's fiction. Hopefully this presentation is not. I'm actually going to be presenting this as a kind of an introduction to critical chain. It's a kind of an unusual introduction, and I'm going to be covering quite a bit of material, so I don't plan to linger a whole lot over the technical aspects of critical chain. In that sense, I assume you have some prior knowledge of the approach and maybe some of the TOC terminology. So I'm not going to worry so much about the technical details. I do expect this to last about an hour, and then we should have plenty of time for questions. I'm hoping, and I hope we have some good questions. Please collect them. We'll catch them at the end, and if you really have something urgent, I think Marcia will be monitoring the comments and be able to interject. As you could see a second ago, I'm not using PowerPoint, and I'm at this point not planning on making the slides available or making this presentation available as slides. I will certainly make a list of the websites that I go through available, and I need to think some about what's a good way to pass this information on. Obviously there's the book, but that's a few months from now. So that's a bit of a work in process. So in any case, fasten your seatbelts, and not just because I'm going to go quickly, but also because I'm using a presentation tool called Prezi. We saw it a second ago. Some people hate it, some people love it. It can cause a little bit of seasickness, but I find that it's actually pretty helpful in laying out and forcing you to lay out the structure of a presentation. So with that in mind, this is in fact the structure of the presentation. You don't have to see all the details. We'll go there. But we have I'll give a bit of an introduction, talk about the kinds of problems we see in the project world, talk about the solution, do a little bit of a summary, and then in the end, a wrap-up. So with that, I'll launch into the main presentation. When I was first thinking about doing this webinar, I thought about calling it something like, we're going about this all backwards. And I think that's true, but it's kind of an irritating title, and also I'm not sure it's entirely correct. But there are a lot of things that we say that I think are not quite right. Also, I think a lot of the problems that we in the TOC world, as well as our clients in business, find that are self-inflicted. Behaviors and values are important, and I would encourage you to challenge everything. And so along all of these lines, I'd like to start by asking a question of everyone who's on the webinar, and hopefully I can see the comments as they come by. Maybe not. Well, maybe not. Marcia, do I have that chance, or am I out of luck as far as seeing what people are saying?
I mean, hold on.
Jessica, you'll be able to see those, right?
I made you an organizer, Rob, so that way you can go ahead and see question answers.
Probably on mute.
Thanks, Jessica.
What I'd like to do is, if this can work, is have everybody think a little bit about how you would define a project buffer. Those of you at least who are familiar with the concept, which should be most, and maybe type that into your little panel. What is the purpose of the project buffer? To answer what is it, what is the purpose? I'll give a moment. I'm not going to pick on anybody, so you don't need to feel bad about a partial answer or whatever. Okay. So I see this under the provide safety, protect due date, protect purposes, protect the due date, protect against variability, accumulate safety to protect the due date. Okay, good. These are all for sure. Sorry, I'm going through the list. Yep. These are all for sure the answers that we normally give. And in fact, if you look at the TOC-ICO dictionary, it says a time buffer placed at the end of a project to protect against variation in the time it takes to complete tasks on the critical chain. I don't want to nitpick about pieces of that, what it protects against, and so on. But what I would like to suggest is that, in fact, people have been putting time in the schedules to protect their commitments for probably thousands of years. The real problem is that people have been wasting that time. So I would suggest that the actual purpose of the project buffer is to to make the protection visible and keep us from wasting it. In other words, it's a means of protecting us from ourselves. And that gets back to the point up here of self-inflicted problems, but it's also a kind of a different way to look at the project buffer. So it's not really necessarily to protect against variation in time. We're already doing that. People do it all the time. What it's really there for is to protect us from wasting that time. And part of the problem is we still waste that safety time, even with project buffers. And that's a big part of the problem. Some of you have probably were at the TOC-ICO conference a couple of years ago in Palisades, New York, where Lisa Scheinkopf presented essentially Ellie Goldrat's last thoughts and ideas. One of the big pieces of that, and I think a pretty strong statement that was made, is this section right here. Go to any project environment, even where CCPM was implemented, do you still see bad multitasking? Yes, and it is big, very big. It's been reduced, why not eliminated? That's a pretty strong statement, and I think it's true. So if you think about it, we've been doing critical chain for whatever, 15 or 20 years, depending on how you count it, and we've been attacking multitasking for a good chunk of that time. And yet people are still doing it. It's happening all the time in pretty much every organization. I suggest that part of the reason that we haven't been making as much progress as we would like is that we've been thinking about it in terms of how can people multitask? Where's the work coming from? What are the different ways that it happens? How can we prevent that work from creeping into the system? I would suggest that what we should really be thinking about is why people must multitask, what compels them to continue doing it, even when, in many cases, we take away a lot of the work. So this is all kind of a TOC ICO sort of introduction, and the kind of the critical chain description piece starts here. So in today's world, there's the kind of the standard, high stress, high variability. We need more speed, predictability, productivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I like the quote on the left. All organizations are perfectly designed to get the results they get, because it's a very polite way of saying it's your own damn fault, or it's our own damn faults. If we don't like what our organization is doing, we should be doing things differently. And I think that's true, very much true, of multitasking. The same way, this is one of my favorite little cartoon panels. I'm not going to stop torturing myself until I figure out the cause of my pain. It's so often the case. We keep doing things wrong and we keep expecting different results. But the question is, what are the wrong things and why do we do them? Multitasking is not a core problem. So what is the problem? I believe it comes down to values. Typically, what people in organizations value without even thinking about them. And I think a lot of times the things that we do without thinking cause us a lot more harm than the things that we think about. To me, the concept of applying values could easily be a more important paradigm shift than even critical chain. That seems like a fairly radical statement, but in any case, I think values are very closely entwined with critical chain. So for now, I'll ask you to suspend your disbelief and bear with me for a little while. So the question is, what do we value in today's organizations? There are several things that cause us to be considered good citizens, or if we don't do them, cause us to be considered bad citizens. One is responsiveness. We're expected to be responsive. Somebody asks us a question, they stop by our office, they send us an email, they expect to get something back, right? That's an important part of being a good citizen. Of course, it can be kind of irritating if you're standing at the counter trying to check out of a store and somebody picks up the phone and starts talking, or somebody starts answering questions of other customers. But in general, responsiveness is part of the culture of most organizations. Another piece is getting things started. When I give somebody something to do, typically expect them to get going on it. And if it's sitting on the shelf a week later, I'm not going to be very happy about it. If I buy a new book, I'll probably open it up and start reading and figure out, hey, is this a good book? Is it something interesting? Even if I have several other books that I'm also in the middle of. And then a third value is deadlines. And this is, in a sense, kind of the coin of the realm in most companies today. And it is strongly related to project management, actually a lot of things. So we value hitting deadlines. And I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail to talk about where the problems come from. How does each of these values cause problems and essentially cause us to multitask? So responsiveness, it's pretty clear that if we are constantly being responsive to people, we're constantly being interrupted and multitasking and so on. And it's not a hard point to make. I'm not going to belabor it here. One simple area is focus, and a very obvious way of explaining how bad responsiveness can be is when you lose focus and you're driving. So if you're talking on the cell phone and driving, some statistics indicate that you're 4 times as likely to have an accident. If you're texting while you're driving, statistics indicate more like 20 times as likely to have an accident. And you can find out all kinds of things about how your response time goes way down, it gets much worse, and so on. I actually, over here, I have a picture of a cell phone of a young man who was killed when his car flipped over early this year. And essentially the point is it can be a tragic effect of being responsive and, as a consequence, losing focus. Another area is multitasking, and there are a number of exercises related to this. So some of you may have seen the confetti factory that was presented at Palisades. There's Tony Rizzo's bead experiment. There's methods for writing numbers and letters and maybe shapes on pieces of paper. Lots of different exercises, which, any of them are good. I recommend them. This is a little online game that we have. If you can do some of the others, you may be better off because this requires a little bit of skill with the mouse. But essentially, it involves moving this binder through a maze of approvals till you get to the end. So in this particular example, on the right is the kind of the final statistics for one run that I did. You can see moving the blue binder through took me 6.5 seconds, and the green one took me 7.3 seconds. When I multitasked, so moving individual segments through the maze and going back and forth, they both took much longer. The piece that really isn't discussed a whole lot, kind of in the multitasking literature at large, is the impact on cycle times. So instead of 6.5 seconds start to finish, in the multitasking world it took 19.6 seconds, so 3 times as long. And then in the same thing for the green binder. And in addition, of course, putting things down and picking things up has a big impact on efficiency, on productivity. So in this case, you could almost do a third maze in the time that was saved by not multitasking. So you can play with this if you like. As I said, I think I'll send a list of URLs to Marcia for, maybe there's a way to put that on the website associated with the presentation. There's also a video. Unfortunately, these don't seem to work well on GoToMeeting. I'll try to play it, but we'll see. So you can see he's got to decorate the kids. And then he has to ring the bell at the end. And in the middle, he has to service the customers in his spare time. Okay, I'm going to move on under the assumption that this is pretty jerky. So what you're seeing is not the best quality, which is why you're probably better off looking at this on your own. Is that still true, Marcia?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we'll just continue on then. Thanks. Next piece is getting things started, and there are a lot of, again, ways of illustrating how starting too much stuff causes problems. Again, we have another game over here that I won't go into, but you can copy down the URL, and I will provide it. Number of different ways to show how starting too much stuff causes problems, and again, leads to multitasking. But one simple exercise is this riddle. Let's suppose you're the project manager for Project X, and we have 3 tasks done by 3 different people, Andy, then Beth, and then Carla. And each task should take 2 days. And I'll ask, how long should the project take, and what resource do you ask for first? Now, I'm not going to make it a quiz because the answers are pretty obvious. But if you want to multiply 3 by 2 as I'm talking, you can certainly do that. But I'll also warn you that this is a multitasked environment. And so while, of course, anyone would predict 6 days, and I'm going to ask for resource Andy to start with, in reality, I can tell you that the project took 12 days because there was a lot of multitasking. In particular, let's see if I can, sorry. In particular, this is what was really going on. There was Project W at the same time as Project X. So you can see that Project X took 12 days because Andy was going back and forth, so everything took 4 days. And then Beth was doing the same thing, and then Carla. And so if I ask the question again, what resource do you ask for first? Then maybe you need to think a little bit more carefully. Because a much better answer than Andy is nobody. Instead of both projects taking 12 days, in this case, Project W took 6, and Project X took 8 from this starting point to this ending point. Both projects dramatically better off by just postponing the second one. Be staggering, if you will. And then finally, another piece, and I'll only play just a little bit of this one. You've probably seen it before, but it's the I Love Lucy episode.
All right, girls, listen carefully. This is the wrapping department. Now, the candy will be passed along the conveyor belt and continue into the next room where the girls will pack it. Now, your job is to take thought you were down.
So if I move on, you can see conveyor belts going along, and more and more candies are showing up, and it's pretty funny. So I recommend that you look at it if you get a chance. Again, I'll send out the URL. Also, of course, you can search in YouTube for the Candy Factory. Sorry. Now, the next piece is probably the most difficult to describe, and in some ways kind of the most important, which is deadlines. I use a pretty broad definition of deadlines, which is basically dates that you really need to hit. It could be a formal measurement. It could be an informal measurement. You said you'd get something by Tuesday. It could be, this project has to complete by December 31st. We could actually even make the definition broader and say that deadlines are lines in the sand, explicit single numbers that you have to make, like budget numbers. In any case, I'll talk a little bit about the negatives of deadline dates to start with, and then get a little bit broader going forward. So if you have to come up with a deadline represented by this flag, chances are you're going to add some safety time, right? Because you want to make sure you have a high probability of meeting that date. If you add safety time, there's a certain amount of negotiation that takes place. So typically the person doing the work or responsible for the deadline wants more time. Typically the person responsible for the end results, management, wants less time, wants things done earlier. So rather than a discussion of, let's say, some kind of landing zone of where this task might complete, you have a negotiation. One effect of that negotiation is multitasking. So let's say you have a 4-week, you've committed to 4 weeks for a task. It's really 2 weeks of work. You can accept other things and other deadlines. Unfortunately, because you're trying to hit all of these deadlines, chances are you're switching back and forth. And because the project managers want to make sure that you're getting stuff done, another reason that you're switching back and forth. So multitasking is one effect of deadlines. Loss of data or loss of prioritization data is another one. And I'll illustrate that here. Suppose you have a couple of tasks, A and B, that you could be working on, and they're for different projects. So suppose you could work task A for project X or task B for project Y. Each one is 5 days long. Should take about 5 days. Task A's deadline is 5 days from now. Task B's deadline is 10 days from now. Which task do you work first? Most people would say, I'm going to work on task A because that's the more urgent deadline. But suppose task A is actually 15 days from delaying project X, and task B is 10 days from delaying project Y. Now which task do you work on first? Chances are you're going to work on task B, right? Because real impact in terms of the overall project, task B is more important. But now suppose project X is worth, let's say, $1 million for every day it's delivered earlier. That's a good round number, which, by the way, is not that uncommon in, let's say, the semiconductor world or drug development. Let's say project Y is worth $1,000 a day. Now which task do you work first? And it gets a lot more difficult. So the answer is less obvious, but it certainly shouldn't be dictated by deadlines, which tend to be fairly arbitrary, and they tend to be not kept up to date. There's a lot more to this topic of deadlines. I wrote an article for the PMI Scheduling Community of Practice, actually presented a paper at their conference this year. People were surprisingly agreeable to the idea that deadlines are a bad thing. I don't think it changed anybody's behavior. But I'd like to say a couple of words about broadening the impact of deadlines. I mentioned pledges. You've probably seen how if you get to the end of the fiscal year and you have extra money, you want to use it up so you get that money next time. And if you don't have extra money, if you have too little money, you start to cut back on travel budgets and consulting budgets and everything discretionary. What you have with deadlines is actually a kind of homeostasis. The system seeks equilibrium around the deadline. If a task or project deadline is, you're early, then you might relax and spend your time on other things. On the other hand, if you're late, you'll work harder, maybe your weekends and evenings, and try to hit the deadline. It's homeostatic. Same thing can happen with earned value kinds of numbers. Are you above or below 1.0 on your schedule performance or cost performance index? An example I like is children's mastery tests. So if a school district is required to have a certain number of, or certain percentage of kids above a particular test score, they're going to put a lot of emphasis on kids they can get to that level. Or maybe kids who are a little above that level but they don't want to fall back. But if the kid will never get to that level or is already at that level, they may not get as much attention from the school district. So a real killer that we don't really talk about much regarding deadlines is they not only create an incentive sometimes to work harder, but they also can create an incentive to work less hard, in addition to all the multitasking and lack of clarity that I've talked about already. So let me kind of give a summary sort of picture of the situation that we find ourselves in. If you imagine this is how a project might flow, and we attach all these deadlines to the different tasks, and of course the lines are connections between the tasks. What happens in real life is the green kind of represents the work that people put into a given task. There's a lot of starting and stopping. There's a lot of working part-time. There's a lot of essentially white space, wasted time that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And essentially a very chaotic environment. In fact, predictability is very difficult because it's really dependent on how much you multitask and how much you get interrupted. And who can predict that? If you look at a specific task, for example, let's say we look at this one in the middle, it could be a fairly typical example. I get this task given to me to work on. I'm finishing up on something else. Doesn't seem urgent, so I don't start work for a little while. Then I do some work just to see if I'm on track. Then I put it back on the back burner for a while, pick it up again to make sure I'm still not in trouble, put it on the back burner, and then finally really work hard to try to get it out the door. That picture is what we have to try to attack. And the answer, which yes, I'm finally getting to, comes from the world of Agile. Maybe you've heard of the Agile Manifesto. It's essentially a set of 4 values. What I like about the story of the Agile Manifesto, if you go to the website, is you essentially have 20-some Agile gurus in a room for a ski resort for a weekend trying to come to some sort of agreement. And even 2 gurus in the same room will have trouble reaching agreement. But they were actually able to do that in a fairly impressive way by starting with a set of values. And it's not values like thou shalt not kill. It's relative values like we value working software over comprehensive documentation. What that means is not that we don't like comprehensive documentation, it's that we value working software more. In a sense, we subordinate comprehensive documentation to working software. That same concept, that same values idea, relative values, can apply in a lot of places in TOC. You can immediately see it with the cost world, throughput world. But here I'm talking about critical chain. So let me talk about it in the context of the relay race. Because that's really the paradigm we want. We want people to get things, work them, start to finish, and then move them on, very much like a relay race. So if I take those earlier values that are so common in organizations and put them in the context of this sort of project manifesto, so to start with, I get, we value priorities over responsiveness. It's not that we can't be responsive, it's that we have to put it in context of what our priorities are. We want to subordinate responsiveness to priorities, especially, of course, important priorities. Ideally, in this situation, we would want to think about what the priorities of our responses are, right? So by saying that we value priorities over responsiveness, we're not saying stop being responsive, because that'll never work, and it's not necessarily a good way to live anyway. But what we are saying is, here's how to think of priorities and responsiveness. Maybe an even more obvious one is we value finishing over starting. It's not that we don't want to start things. We have to start things. You'll never be able to finish anything if you don't start anything. But we value finishing over starting. And then finally, deadlines. As I said earlier, deadlines are kind of coin of the realm in most organizations. That's how people communicate. Telling them to stop using dates, while I think it could be a great way to run an organization in many situations, it's not going to happen. But if we say we value speed over deadlines, subordinate the deadlines to the speed, get rid of that homeostasis, then I think we're starting to make some real progress. So what I'm going to go into next is how, in a technical sense, how we implement these values, some of the, how they relate to critical chain technology. I'm not going to talk much about actually how to cause the change. That's an extremely big topic, and of course you can get the book and get some more ideas. But I think this will be enough for one webinar, and maybe more than enough. So let's start with the first value, and let's just talk about priorities. How can we prioritize all the things that we're typically responsive about, that we typically interrupt all the time? So this is one way of dividing up your work. There are certainly others. The acronym is PICME, for what it's worth. One set of things that we do can fit into the category of planned interruptions. So for example, email. Maybe you pick a couple of times during the day when you do email, and the rest of the time you reserve for focused work. Meetings. Maybe there are specific days where you do meetings. We talk about where your company does meetings, or your functional group. We've talked about, in other contexts, about setting up specific people who are, let's say, on call to take customer complaints or urgent customer problems, so that most people can spend their time on focused work. There are a lot of things you can do to plan your interruptions so that you don't have to be constantly interrupting your priorities with responsiveness. In terms of actual tasks, concrete things that take, a real significant amount of time, you can divide it into 4 categories. One is critical non-project work. So, for example, customer calls up and product isn't working, what do I do? Or you have to attend a webinar on a Saturday. That we put at the very top. Urgent and important. Okay, that has to happen. Next are the project tasks. Key project tasks, obviously critical chain tasks, maybe on certain projects, tasks that are near to being on the critical chain. And then more flexible project tasks, the other project work. And then finally, in the green category is everything else. So if I relate this to critical chain technology, we want to get credible schedules so everyone is willing to operate off of the same playbook. So we take into account resource limitations. We build the schedules with the project team. We get them understood and approved by management so that any commitment dates are understood, any buffers are understood. And we get rid of task due dates as far as we can. So that gives us a schedule. And of course, as part of that, we identify key tasks in the critical chain. In this case, there's no link between these tasks, which is sort of a nod towards the resource limitations. Chances are this is a resource dependency. And you have all the others. Moving on to finishing over starting. Again, several things that we do in the process of valuing finishing over starting. Here's one example. Suppose you have a couple of tasks on your plate, A and B, and you could work on either one. So each one is a 3-day task. I could start A or I could start B. Let's suppose I pick task A to start with. And the day goes by and I do a day's worth of work, and now I have this situation. Great, I've made a day's worth of progress on task A, but now B is pushed out a day. It's a day more urgent. That is kind of a problem. That could tempt me to follow this picture, switching back and forth all the time. By following this value, finishing over starting, that would indicate that we should first finish task A and then finish task B. And of course, as we know, that's going to end up being best for everything. Another area that gets a lot of discussion, I won't spend a lot of time on here, is pacing projects in the pipeline or staggering them. So if Joe in this kind of simple network is a limited resource, then I shouldn't start project 1 and project 2 at the same time, because then Joe's going to be overloaded. Chances are pretty good that he's going to multitask. And if you're familiar with, I better do the intro before I go to that. If you're familiar with Broadway shows and the Muppets, I always like this.
It's not where you start, it's where you finish. It's not how you go, it's how you land.
And moving right along, finally is the third one, we value speed over deadlines. You'll notice that in my kind of development of critical chain here, I haven't mentioned buffers. So a critical piece of understanding what your key tasks are is having schedules. Unfortunately, as we've seen, having task times with safety added makes us much more likely to multitask and to have bad information and all these kinds of things. So we do remove safety time from tasks. We aggregate the safety time into buffers. And here I'm just showing a project buffer. If you want to hear about feeding buffers, you can listen to my presentation from the Bad Nauheim TOC-ICO conference. And we manage the buffers. So we've taken out the safety time. I mentioned this early on in the talk. We've taken out the safety time, and we're going to manage it and make sure we don't waste it. So here's a very simple picture of buffer management. Again, not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but at the bottom is tasks A, B, and C. That's my little project. It has a project buffer at the end, and this red line indicates where we are in time. Up above is the fever chart. You're probably familiar with that. So horizontally, % project complete, vertically, % buffer used. So suppose some time goes by, we do some work on task A, but it's not as much as we might have hoped to get done. So we still have 3/4 of task A left. We've pushed everything out, we've consumed some buffer. That in turn shows up on the fever chart as some buffer used and some % project complete. In this case, it's in the yellow zone. Now suppose we do some more work and we actually accomplish more than we expected to. So the remainder of A and B and C moves back to the left a little bit. We've recovered some buffer, and as a consequence, the line in the fever chart goes down. So that's a pretty handy picture. And of course, there are the multi-project fever charts as well. And that's the, a few of the kind of the technical ideas behind speed over deadlines. But when we talk about doing the relay race, it really is a culture change, and we really are changing from emphasis on responsiveness to priorities, emphasis on starting to finishing, emphasis on deadlines to emphasis on speed. As I said, I don't plan to talk a whole lot about how to cause the change. That's a fairly big topic, but here are a few elements that I think are really critical. One is agreement on the values. Going through this kind of discussion with people and understanding the extent to which, by being responsive and just getting things started and talking about deadlines, they are hurting themselves, self-inflicted problems. Getting some consensus on work standards. So the values are very high level. They're at a level where I think most people can understand what it means, but they don't necessarily understand how to address them. So with work standards, you're talking about what do we actually do differently to make these values happen. So one work standard might be it's okay to say no or not now. Or it might be the boss shouldn't ask people to do things without having a pretty good idea of what the priorities are. It might be discussions about email, because in a lot of organizations, you're pretty much expected to respond instantaneously to emails. So if you suddenly start taking a few hours before you respond, that could cause a problem. So there's a whole agreement on how you're going to work together. And a big piece of that is senior level participation. Very often, first of all, the problems, the reinforcement of these traditional values comes from management. It's sort of a top-down pressure in a way. I mean, if the boss gives somebody something to someone, they want them to work on it. Also, it's really important to build cheerleaders in the organization. And if the cheerleaders are the senior people, that's the best of all. And then finally in my little list here is frequent communication. You don't just give some training to people and expect that suddenly their behavior will be different. You have to talk about how it's working. How are the values working? How are the work standards working? What can we do differently? How can we fix things? What's going on? How's it going for you? And also, what are the values? Is it working? Because if it's not providing value for the individuals who are doing it, They're not going to change. So this is the real thumbnail sketch of some of the key elements of creating the culture change. Then if I put this in context and kind of summarize what I've gone through as far as the project manifesto solution, if you will. We have the project manifesto at the top. And this is sort of a bad I/O map, you could call it, in TSC terms. So assuming we have this project manifesto, and we've kind of agreed to implement it, the paradigm is the relay race. And these are the three values. It kind of splits off into two pieces. One piece is the relay race culture change. The other side is the prioritization, especially the scheduling approach. And together these produce dramatic benefits, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, you can actually get benefits by attacking either side. So just by doing critical change scheduling, people can get substantial improvements. Just by having decent priorities and having intelligent discussions about what you have to do, you can reduce a certain amount of multitasking and you can get better flow through the organization. If you do multi-project scheduling, that can help reduce multitasking even more. Very often, though, it doesn't get rid of the homeostasis. So what you want to do, if you want to validate that, is check how often projects are completed early. So it's not just due date performance, it's earliness performance. And by the way, as another aside, if you look at pretty much any measurement of projects, it's due date performance, Standish group, whatever you want. They never talk about how early or how late. That's a huge kind of flaw in how we look at projects. So very often people will put in place decent scheduling, but not really emphasize the culture change. And we've found a good way to explain the culture change, a way that really resonates with people, is through the project manifesto values. If you have the combination, then you kind of have the best of all worlds, because you have the behavior change, you have the tools necessary to support it, and if you can build the enthusiasm, build the cheerleaders, you can make it self-sustaining. And that's where the benefits that we talk about come from. And you can list whatever you want. Variation is a huge one, because if you don't have to accommodate how the multitasking is happening, you can reduce variation quite a bit. Stress and errors and wasted time, we've talked about. The speed, especially project cycle times, predictability, productivity, all go up. So tremendous potential, and more potential than many organizations are getting today, even using critical change. Now, I also mentioned that there are 4 values, and there are. This one is a bit of a cop-out, and it's not one that we typically talk about with kind of first-line managers and individual contributors, because it's pretty high level. It's a cop-out because, in a sense, it includes all the other goals. So we value shared, or all the other values, excuse me. So we value shared goals over individual goals. That has a few specific meanings in the project world. One is we share information and time, buffer, safety time, rather than hoarding them. So we want credible schedules that we're talking about me and you against the problem instead of me against you. Shared buffers. It also is kind of this value is also kind of a way to talk about resolving conflicts in measurements. So very often you have measurements that reward people for hitting due dates. They don't reward them for beating the due dates or for hitting more important due dates rather than less important due dates. So that's very often, there are very often measurements issues as well. And then there are also procedures, how we do things. So responsiveness, in a sense, is often how we do things. So evaluating some of these things in this context of shared goals, the global picture, as opposed to individual goals, is important. It's not part of the kind of the standard discussion of critical chain, because I think it's at a higher level and it's much more of a management kind of issue. So given all that, this is kind of the wrap up, and I see that my deadline is, self-imposed deadline is just about exactly hit. A few things. So first of all, to get some idea of how the values can change the discussion, think about R&D, especially research projects. A lot of people will say that critical chain is not valid for research projects because you can't set a buffer size. In fact, the problem that you're researching, you may not even have a solution. So how you could possibly attach a buffer to it and create a critical chain schedule is extremely difficult to understand. And this is another case where I suggest that we're going about the whole thing backwards. Think about it instead from the context of the project manifesto. Does it make sense to value priorities over responsiveness? Probably in a lot of cases. It may be different than, let's say, aircraft overhaul. But yes, same thing with finishing over starting. Same thing with speed over deadlines. So I think it, on the one hand, it kind of broadens the relevance of critical chain. Some may claim that that's not really fair because we've gone past critical chain scheduling. But I think it's perfectly reasonable, and I think the values kind of, for me at least, encapsulate what I think of intuitively when I think of critical chain. Now, a couple final things. I think I mentioned the book is scheduled to be available Q1 of 2014. A couple of little teasers, things that you can think about, maybe challenge your intuition a little bit more. One is fever charts. Very popular part of critical chain. In fact, very often when you sell critical chain, you sell fever charts. My question is, do fever charts support speed or at the expense of deadlines, or deadlines at the expense of speed? Think about what it means when you're in the green. That's one question to think about. Another question that actually the book gets into a little bit, it's sort of allowed to because it's fiction, is valuing what you need versus valuing what you love. So should you value what you need over what you love, or what you love over what you need? And the context for the book is, should I spend my time at work or with my family? But there are plenty of other ways to think about that as well. And that's sort of along the lines of the personal manifesto concept, which is way beyond the scope of this webinar. Anyway, that basically covers what I wanted to cover. I apologize for going so quickly through a lot of things, but hopefully I've given you some things to think about. And at this point, I'll open it up for questions.
Okay.
So for those of you, oh, go ahead, Jessica.
I was just going to say, as Rob said, please type your questions into the questions panel or chat area. Or if you have a microphone and want to ask your question directly, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll open up your microphone for you. And while you guys are typing in questions, Marcia has a few announcements.
All right, I would like to remind everyone that the call for papers is open for the 2014 International Conference, and it will be held in Washington, D.C. next June 8th through 11th. You can find the information about the submission process on the website at tocico.org, and the deadline for submissions is December 31st. And as always, we're looking for TOC presentations on the more widely known applications of the management processes such as project management, marketing, finance, and production, and in the field of education. In addition, for this conference, there will be a dual focus on the significant impact that management the TOC way is having on the government, public sector, and the healthcare industry. So we are looking also for submissions in those two areas. So come to the conference to upgrade your TOC knowledge and choose. You'll have probably more than 75 other presentations to choose from. Registration for the conference is open, and we encourage you to take advantage of the early bird discount. Conference site rooms sell out quickly, so please don't delay in completing your registration for too long. Okay. Also encourage you to become members. There are over 400 videos that you will have available if you become a member. You'll have discounts on conference registrations, all 6 strategy and tactics trees that Ellie has written, free access to 45 recorded webinars, and we get new ones in there all the time, and many other good things in there as well. So we will turn it back now over to Jessica and Kelvin for the questions section.
Actually, that's Jessica
I'm sorry.
and Rob.
You know what?
That's okay.
That's my fault. I have one more announcement. I apologize. Hello. Dr. Kelvin Youngman presenting 2 types of clouds, session 2, didactic arguments and local global clouds, on December 14th, which is next Saturday from 12 to 1:30 Pacific time, and we encourage you to be a part of that webinar as well. Thanks for your understanding in my faux pas there.
No
Go ahead.
So we do have, I guess not a question, but more of a comment that came in from Adele Retimo. He says, "Hi Rob, I've just translated a book called Tame the Flow to Portuguese, which proposes the application of TOC and CCPM to agile environments, particularly using Scrum and Kanban." And then he says, "I would love to translate your book as well." So I guess just a quick comment there about translations.
Well, that's actually a good, maybe more general point. My email address is right here, so if you want to contact me, hopefully it will get through.
Yep, so Adele, if you want to go ahead and email him about that, please feel free to do so.
Yeah.
And I don't see any other questions that have come in.
It says here John Hudson has a question.
That was actually back on when we had the comments about the U.S. in the beginning about that the point of a project buffer. So,
Gotcha.
So unless you have any ending comments, Rob, that you'd like to say, I think we are finished.
No, I mean, you know, hopefully I would hope that the lack of questions is because there's a lot to think about and not because I've explained everything there is to explain, or because nobody understood any of it. Okay. Yeah.
All right. We had another comment from Steve. He asks, or he said, "You brought up a lot of great points, but I like the idea of what being in the green on a fever chart does. It reinforces multitasking." So.
That is certainly a very strong argument, a problematic argument, because if you have a project that's worth many thousands of dollars a day on up, and people are relaxing because, hey, no problem, it's green, that could be an issue. That's a good point.
Okay. Well, everybody, besides that, just said thank you very much. Great presentation. And I agree. So thank you, Rob, for being here and for sharing your time with us. And as Rob said, he'll go ahead and share the links, to the different YouTube videos and everything that he had and the different project management games that you can go and play online. That'll probably be up with the recording in about a day or so. So Thank you very much, and
I'll
we
send that to you.
yeah, thank you. All right.
Yep.
Thank you
All right.
all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar next weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.